I've been driving big rigs for as long as I can remember. The road feels like home, the hum of the engine, the blur of passing towns, and the quiet that comes when it's just you and the highway. But even after all these years, I've never been able to explain what happened one foggy night along Highway 89 in Utah. I was hauling a load of lumber from Boise to Flagstaff, running a tight schedule. The dispatcher wanted the delivery by dawn, so I'd planned to drive straight through the night. It was early November, and a thick fog had rolled in as the sun went down. The world outside turned into a gray haze, my headlights barely cutting through the mist. It was the kind of night that makes you uneasy for no reason. The radio wasn't picking up any stations, so I was left with the steady thrum of the tires on asphalt and the occasional groan of the engine as I shifted gears. The road was empty, not a single car in either direction, and the isolation was starting to get to me. Around 11 p.m., I saw the first sign of trouble. In my mirrors, a pair of headlights appeared, faint at first but growing brighter. Another truck, I thought, nothing unusual. Drivers often stick together on long hauls, even if they're strangers. But something about these lights felt off. They didn't bounce or shift like headlights normally do on uneven roads. They stayed perfectly level, steady, as if the truck was gliding rather than driving. I glanced at my speedometer, 65 miles per hour, right on the limit. The other truck wasn't gaining on me, just keeping pace, its lights hovering in my mirrors like a shadow I couldn't shake. "All right, buddy," I muttered to myself. "Either pass me or back off." I flipped the CB radio to an open channel. "Hey driver," I called out. "You need something? You're riding my tail pretty close." No answer. The static buzzed in my ears, but there was no response from the other truck. I frowned, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe their radio was broken, or maybe they just didn't feel like talking. But as the miles ticked by, the headlights stayed right where they were. I decided to test them. Slowing down to 60, I watched the mirror, waiting to see if they'd adjust. They did. The lights dimmed slightly as the truck matched my speed, still keeping the same eerie distance. My hands tightened on the wheel. "Fine," I muttered. "Let's see how fast you can go." I pressed the gas, speeding up to 70, then 75. Most trucks don't like pushing much past that. Too hard on the engine, too risky if the road curves. But the other truck kept up, its headlights unwavering. That's when I started to feel real fear. I flipped the CB radio again, this time to a more specific channel used by highway patrols. "This is Big Red hauling southbound on Highway 89, I said, keeping my voice steady. "Got another truck tailing me, no ID, no response. Anybody got eyes on this stretch of road?" More static. Then silence. The fear turned into dread. Something was wrong, really wrong. I glanced in the mirror again, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. The headlights weren't normal. They had a faint bluish tint, almost like LED lights, but too pale and cold. They didn't belong to any truck I'd ever seen. My hands were slick with sweat now. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears. The road stretched on, endless and empty, with no sign of a rest stop or exit. Just fog and darkness. And those lights. I kept driving, hoping the truck would finally veer off or disappear, but it didn't. It stayed with me, mile after mile, until the unease became unbearable. Finally, I saw a turnoff, a dirt road leading to what looked like an old way station. I didn't care if it was abandoned or operational, I just needed to get off the main highway. I signaled and slowed down, pulling onto the dirt road. The headlights behind me followed. The way station was dark, its windows boarded up and the sign faded with age. I stopped my truck and killed the engine, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The headlights of the other truck stopped too, just a few yards behind me. I sat there, frozen, staring at the mirror. The lights didn't move. They didn't flicker or dim. They just glowed, cold and steady. And then, they went out. For a moment, the world was pitch black. I couldn't see the truck, couldn't see the road, couldn't see anything. My chest tightened as panic clawed at me. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the passenger door. I jumped so hard I nearly hit my head on the roof. The sound echoed through the cab, followed by another bang, then another, like someone or something was pounding to get in. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer. Just the relentless pound. I reached for the tire iron I kept under the seat, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grip it. The banging stopped. Silence. For a long moment, I just sat there, clutching the tire iron, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard it, a voice, low and distorted, like a bad radio signal. It was coming from outside the truck, but I couldn't make out the words. I leaned closer to the window, squinting into the darkness. That's when I saw the shape. It wasn't a man. It wasn't even human. Tall and thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles, it stood just outside the passenger door. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a blank, smooth surface, like polished metal. The voice came again, garbled and static-filled, but this time it was coming from the CB radio. "Help me," it said. The words sent a chill down my spine. They weren't a plea, they were a mockery, a mimicry of human speech. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I dropped the tire iron, slammed the truck into reverse, and floored it. The tires kicked up dirt and gravel as I sped back onto the highway. The fog was thicker now, swallowing the road in every direction. My hands shook on the wheel, my eyes darting to the mirrors. The headlights were gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing was still out there, watching, waiting. I didn't stop until I reached the lights of a small diner just outside Flagstaff. I pulled into the parking lot and sat there, trembling, until the sun started to rise. When I finally went inside, the waitress took one look at me and poured a cup of coffee without asking. "You okay, Honorable?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that I never drive Highway 89 alone anymore. And I never, ever look too long in the mirrors. Because sometimes, what's behind you is worse than anything up ahead. I've been a trucker for 15 years, and in that time, I've seen things I'd rather forget. Accidents, strange people, and miles of empty roads that seem to stretch on forever. This job can take a toll on you, but nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever shaken me like what happened one October night on Route 66. It started like any other haul. I'd picked up a load of steel from Kansas City, bound for a construction site in Albuquerque. It was a long route, and the dispatch had been delayed, which meant I was starting the trip later than usual. I wasn't thrilled about driving through the night, but I'd done it before. The road doesn't scare me. It's the people you run into sometimes that'll make your hair stand on end. The first few hours were uneventful. The highway was deserted, just me and my rig cutting through the darkness. The moon hung high, bathing the empty landscape in a pale, ghostly glow. There was something unsettling about the stillness, though. Normally, I'd pass the occasional car or see the faint glow of lights from distant towns, but that night, it felt like I was the only one left in the world. Somewhere around midnight, I saw him. At first, it was just a shape on the side of the road, standing near the guardrail where the highway curved. As I got closer, my headlights lit him up, a man, tall and thin, wearing an old dusty coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He had one arm out, thumb up, the universal signal for a hitchhiker. Now, I don't pick up hitchhikers. It's a rule I've stuck to my whole career. Too many horror stories, somebody pulls a knife on you, robs you, or worse. But there was something about this guy that made me hesitate. He wasn't waving me down frantically like someone in trouble. He just stood there, still as a statue, waiting. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was the emptiness of the road, or maybe it was the way he stood, like he'd been expecting me. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled to the shoulder. As the truck hissed to a stop, I rolled down the passenger window a crack. "You need a ride?" I asked. The man stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was stiff or cold. He didn't answer right away, just stared at me from under the brim of his hat. Finally, he nodded. "Just up the road," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel being ground under a boot. I hesitated. Something about him didn't sit right with me, but the emptiness of the highway and the chill in the air made me feel sorry for him. Against every instinct, I reached over and unlocked the door. He climbed in without a word and settled into the passenger seat. The cab immediately felt different, colder, heavier, like the air itself had thickened. I adjusted the heater, but it didn't. We drove in silence for a few miles. I kept sneaking glances at him out of the corner of my eye. He was facing the window, his hat pulled low, hiding most of his face. His hands rested on his lap, pale and bony, like they belonged to someone much older. There was something wrong about the way he sat, too stiff, too still, like he wasn't entirely alive. I shook the thought off. Long hours on the road can make your mind play tricks on you. Still, I couldn't ignore the smell. It started faint, like something sweet but sour at the same time. As we drove, it grew stronger, filling the cab until it was hard to breathe. It reminded me of rotting fruit, or maybe flowers left too long in stagnant water. I rolled down my window a little, but the smell lingered. I tried to distract myself with small talk. "Been out here long?" I asked. He didn't turn to look at me. "Long enough," he said. His voice sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just rough. It had a strange, hollow quality, like it was coming from somewhere deep and empty. I tightened my grip on the wheel, forcing myself to focus on the road. About 10 miles later, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His reflection, it wasn't there. The windshield showed the faint glow of the dashboard and my own face clear as day, but on his side, there was nothing. Just the empty highway stretching out behind us. I glanced at the side mirror. Same thing. My heart started pounding and I felt a bead of sweat slide down my temple despite the cold. "You from around here?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Used to be," he said. "A long time ago." I didn't know what to say to that. The smell was unbearable now, so strong it made my eyes water. My stomach churned and I had to fight the urge to gag. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. Up ahead, I saw a small turnout, a gravel patch where the highway widened for a moment. I flicked on my turn signal and started to slow down. "This is as far as I can take you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, he turned to face me. That's when I saw his face, or what was left of it. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull, grayish and waxy like melted candle wax. His eyes, if you could call them that, were nothing but hollow black sockets. His lips twisted into a grin that stretched too wide, revealing yellowed, uneven teeth. "You can't leave me here," he said, his voice no longer rough but sharp and cold, like ice cracking underfoot. My heart felt like it had stopped. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away from him as fast as I could. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. Reaching over, I yanked the passenger door open. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't move at first, just stared at me with that horrible grin. Then, slowly, he climbed out. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The moment his boots hit the pavement, I slammed the door shut and floored the accelerator. My tires kicked up gravel as I sped away, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I glanced in the mirror, but he wasn't standing where I'd left him. Instead, he was walking down the middle of the road, his figure fading into the darkness. The smell lingered in the cab, clinging to the air and my clothes. I drove for miles before I finally saw the lights of a truck stop up ahead. Pulling into the parking lot, I killed the engine and stumbled out of the cab, my legs shaking. Inside, the diner was bright and warm, filled with the hum of conversation and the clink of silverware. I made my way to the counter and ordered a coffee, my hands still trembling. "You okay?" the waitress asked as she poured my cup. I told her what had happened, about the hitchhiker, his hollow eyes, and the way he smelled of death. As I spoke, her face grew pale, and when I finished, she leaned in close. "You're not the first," she whispered. "There's a story about that stretch of Route 66. Years ago, a trucker lost control on a sharp curve and jackknifed his rig. They say he died on impact, but his body was never found. Some folks claim he still wanders the road, looking for someone to take him home." Her words sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. I left the coffee untouched and climbed back into my truck, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting for his next ride. I've been driving rigs for over 20 years now, crossing the country so many times I could draw the interstate highways with my eyes closed. The road is where I feel at home. But there's one stretch of road I'll never take again. It happened 6 years ago, during a run through West Virginia. I was hauling a load of farm equipment to Charleston and was already running late. The dispatcher had warned me about storms rolling through the Appalachian Mountains, but I figured I could handle it. Truckers learn early on how to drive through rough weather. By the time I hit the Black Hollow stretch, the rain had turned into a downpour. Sheets of water battered the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. The road was narrow, winding through dense forest, and there wasn't another vehicle in sight. That isolation, well, it's not unusual for those mountain roads. but it always makes you feel uneasy. I'd heard stories about Black Hollow, of course. Every driver has. Tales of cars vanishing, of strange lights hovering above the trees, even whispers of ghost sightings. I never paid much attention to that kind of talk. Figured it was just truck stop folklore, meant to spook the rookie. But that night, I started to wonder if the stories were more than just tale. It began as I approached the old bridge that crosses over Black Hollow Creek. The structure is a relic from the 1930s, narrow, rusting, and barely wide enough for a modern rig. The rain made the wooden planks slick, and I slowed down to a crawl, the truck's headlights barely piercing the darkness. As I rolled onto the bridge, something odd happened. The sound of the rain vanished. 1 second, the cab was filled with the roar of water hitting the roof, and the next, it was silent. The kind of silence that presses on your ears, making you feel like the world's been muted. I glanced out the side window, but the creek below was hidden by darkness. The headlights seemed to dim as if the light was being swallowed by the mist that clung to the bridge. And then I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the rain and the poor lighting, a shadow moving along the edge of the bridge. But as I got closer, it took shape. A woman. She stood on the far side of the bridge, drenched from head to toe. Her long dark hair clung to her face, and her dress, an old-fashioned thing, like something out of the 1800s, was torn and dripping with water. I hit the brakes, the truck groaning to a stop. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to roll down the window. "Ma'am," I called out, my voice sounding shaky even to me. "You need..." She didn't answer, just stood there staring at me. I could feel her eyes, though I couldn't see them clearly. It was like she was looking through me, into me, pulling at something deep inside. The truck's engine sputtered. That's when I knew something was wrong. My rig is a reliable beast, and it doesn't just stall out, not like this. The dashboard lights flickered, and the headlights dimmed even further, leaving the cab in near darkness. The woman took a step forward. Something about the way she moved wasn't right. It was jerky, like she wasn't fully in control of her limbs. Water dripped from her hands, pooling on the wooden planks as she came close. I tried the ignition, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Panic set in, and I reached for the CB radio. Static greeted me, nothing but static. The woman was at the edge of the headlights now, her face partially illuminated. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under her eyes. She opened her mouth, and for a moment, I thought she was going to speak. But what came out wasn't a voice. It was a low, guttural wail, like the sound of wind screaming through a canyon. It filled the cab, vibrating through my bones, making every hair on my body stand on end. I slammed the window shut and locked the doors, my hands trembling. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, but the truck wouldn't start, and the woman was still coming closer. Suddenly, the wailing stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I glanced out the windshield, and she was gone. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But then the cab started to fill with the smell of rotting water, stagnant, foul, like a swamp left to fester. I gagged, covering my nose, and that's when I heard the creak of the passenger door handle. Something was trying to get in. The door didn't budge. Thank God I'd locked it, but the handle kept moving, jerking up and down. Then, without warning, the windshield cracked. A jagged line spreading across the glass, as if something had struck it with immense force. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw open the driver's door and jumped out, the rain soaking me instantly. I didn't care. I ran, slipping and sliding on the wet planks of the bridge until I reached the other side. Turning back, I expected to see my truck sitting there, empty. But it was gone. The bridge was empty, the mist thicker than ever. My rig, 32,000 pounds of steel and machinery, had vanished without a trace. I stood there, soaked and shivering, staring at the spot where it had been. The woman was nowhere to be seen, but I could feel her presence, like she was still watching me from the shadows. I don't know how long I stood there before a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A car pulled up, its driver, a local farmer, rolling down the window to ask if I was okay. I told him what had happened, but he just shook his head, his face pale. "You're lucky you made it off that bridge," he said. "Most folks who see her don't." He wouldn't say more, just gave me a ride to the nearest town. The police didn't believe my story, of course, and there was no sign of my truck or its cargo. The insurance company wrote it off as a total loss, blaming the storm for a supposed accident. But I know what I saw. To this day, I avoid Black Hollow and that cursed bridge. And every time I hit the road at night, I keep my eyes on the highway and my doors locked tight. Because out there, in the dark corners of the world, there are things waiting for us. Things we're not meant to understand. Joe Carter had been a truck driver for over 15 years. The road had become a second home to him, his rig, his fortress. With a comfortable rhythm, he traversed the vast highways of America, delivering freight from one city to another. Most days he felt the solitude of the road was peaceful, even therapeutic. But not tonight. Tonight something felt wrong, something he couldn't shake off. It was well past midnight, and the headlights of Joe's big rig illuminated the dark highway stretching before him. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was a constant comforting sound. However, his eyes had begun to feel heavy, and the grip on his steering wheel grew a little looser with each mile. He'd been driving for hours, and his body was starting to remind him of the toll it had taken. His eyelids fluttered, and he knew it was time to stop. As he turned the wheel and slowed his truck down, he spotted a small, weathered sign that read, "Rest stop ahead, 1 mile." He had passed plenty of them before, sometimes just stopping for a quick break, other times taking a nap. But this time, he wasn't just stopping for a short break. He needed to rest. Joe sighed in relief, a chance to stretch his legs, grab a cup of coffee, and get some rest before continuing on the road. The highway was deserted, no other trucks, no cars, just an endless stretch of blacktop with only the occasional flicker of a streetlight. The only sound was the deep rumble of his engine. As he pulled into the rest area, he noticed how empty it looked. The parking lot was nearly deserted, and the whole place felt eerily quiet. A single street lamp flickered overhead, casting long, shaky shadows across the cracked pavement. At the far end of the lot, there was an old, crumbling building. Joe parked his truck near the building and turned off the engine. He took a deep breath, stretching his stiff muscles as he climbed out of the truck. The cool night air hit him like a wave, the chill cutting through his shirt. It felt colder than it should for a summer evening. He glanced around. The lot was nearly empty. He was the only one there, or at least it appeared that way. A slight unease crept into his mind, but he brushed it off. The rest stop wasn't much to look at, but it was as good a place as any to stop for the night. Joe walked toward the building, his boots clicking on the pavement. The door to the rest stop building was old and rusted, the hinges creaking as he pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew, and the dim fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. There was an empty vending machine in the corner, its glass door cracked, and a few chairs were scattered around a table. The place looked abandoned, like it hadn't seen any visitors in years. Joe's eyes scanned the room, and the unease he had felt earlier returned. But again, he shook it off. It was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. He walked into the bathroom, which was just as rundown as the rest of the building. The lights flickered overhead, and the air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and old plumbing. He stood in front of the mirror, splashing water on his face, trying to shake off the exhaustion that had begun to settle in his bones. That's when he heard the first noise. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of something scraping against the floor. He turned his head toward the door, his heart beating faster. No one else had been in the building when he arrived, and the sound had seemed like it came from just outside the bathroom door. He paused, listening intently. The sound came again. This time it was clearer. A soft, shuffling sound. Joe took a deep breath and opened the bathroom door, but the hallway outside was empty. The only thing he could see was the dim light coming from the main room. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. There was something strange about the place, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Get a grip, Joe," he muttered under his breath. He decided to finish up quickly and get back to his truck. The last thing he wanted was to let his mind get the best of him. He walked back to the main room, heading toward the door. But before he could reach it, something caught his eye. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move outside the window. His heart skipped a beat. He froze. A figure, standing just outside the window, stared back at him. It was a tall, shadowy figure, its features obscured by the darkness, but its presence was undeniable. The figure stood still, unmoving, watching him through the glass. Joe's breath hitched in his chest. He could see nothing more than the vague outline of a person, tall, thin, and hunched. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. It just stood there, like a statue. Joe's mind raced. He quickly grabbed his keys, his hands trembling. What was going on? Without thinking, He rushed out the door of the building and toward his truck, his boots pounding against the cracked pavement. But as he approached his rig, something strange happened. The night air seemed to grow colder, the silence heavier. His footsteps echoed in the empty lot. He felt a growing sense of unease, but he told himself it was just the exhaustion getting to him. He climbed into his truck, slammed the door shut, and locked it. His hands were shaking as he inserted the key into the ignition. He turned it, but the engine didn't start. Joe tried again, this time with more force, but the truck remained silent. His stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't right. The engine had never given him trouble before. What was going on? He tried again. Nothing. Panic set in. Outside, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the shadows around the rest stop grew longer, darker. Joe could see the figure from before, still standing there at the edge of the lot, its gaze fixed on him. It was as though the figure was waiting for something. The lights inside the truck flickered. Joe's breath quickened as he looked around the cab, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. The figure had not moved. Then, suddenly, the headlights of the truck flickered on, casting a bright, harsh light onto the parking lot. Joe turned quickly to see if the figure was still there. It was, but now it was closer. The figure had moved, silently, without a sound. It stood just a few feet from the driver's side door. Joe could see it more clearly now. It was tall, taller than any person he'd ever seen. Its skin was pale, almost ghostly, and its eyes gleamed in the dim light, black and empty. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at him. Joe's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow. He reached for the door handle, intending to get out and confront whatever this was. But before he could open the door, the figure raised its hand and slowly pressed it against the window. Joe froze. He could see the fingers, long, thin, and unnatural, against the glass. The figure's hand seemed to stretch as it dragged its fingers across the window, leaving a dark smear. The sound it made was low and unnatural, like scraping metal against metal. Joe's entire body went cold. He couldn't move. His mind raced, but he was frozen in place. He could see the figure's face now, up close, and it was worse than he had imagined. The skin was pale, stretched too tightly across its skull. Its eyes were black voids, with no pupils or whites, just endless darkness. Its mouth was wide, too wide, and it grinned at him, exposing sharp, yellowed teeth. Suddenly, the figure's lips parted, and in a voice that sounded like a low growl, it whispered, "Let me in." Joe's heart skipped a beat. It was as though the voice wasn't coming from the figure, but from inside his head. The words echoed in his skull, vibrating through his entire body. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The truck roared to life, jerking forward with sudden force. Joe didn't look back. He didn't need to. All he knew was that he had to get out of there. He sped down the highway, leaving the rest stop behind. The road stretched out before him, but he didn't feel safe. The feeling of eyes on his back lingered, and the whispers from the figure still echoed in his mind. Joe drove for miles without stopping, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead. It wasn't until dawn broke and the sky lightened that he allowed himself to breathe again. He pulled into a truck stop at the first sign of civilization. His hands were still shaking as he parked his rig and climbed out of the truck. He needed to check his truck, needed to make sure everything was okay. As he walked around to the passenger side of the truck, his stomach dropped. There, written in the dirt on the side of his trailer, were 3 words: "I'm still here." Joe stood frozen for a moment, staring at the words written in the dirt on the side of his trailer. His breath caught in his throat. The chill that had been creeping up his spine was now full-blown terror. The letters were too neat, too deliberate. Whoever or whatever had done this had to have been close. Too close for comfort. His mind raced as he fought to calm his panicked thoughts. He reached out with trembling hands and wiped away the dirt with the sleeve of his jacket, but it didn't feel real. The words seemed to burn into his memory. "I'm still here." He tried to convince himself it was just some cruel prank, some sick joke left by a restless mind. But deep down, Joe knew better. The air around him felt thick, as though the world was holding its breath. His heartbeat hammered in his chest, and his mouth felt dry. He turned his head slowly, scanning the quiet, deserted truck stop. Everything was still. But then, in the corner of his eye, something caught his attention. A shadow. It wasn't the shadow of a person or a truck or anything ordinary. It was dark and unnatural, stretching unnervingly long across the ground. He snapped his head in the direction of the shadow. There was nothing there. Joe blinked, trying to clear the fog in his brain. "Get a grip," he muttered under his breath, trying to rationalize. "It's just the light, just a trick of the morning." But as he turned back to his truck, the feeling of being watched returned, cold and suffocating. His hands were shaking so badly now that it was difficult to get the key into the lock. The world around him seemed to grow quieter, more oppressive. He could feel the weight of something dark and old pressing down on him, as though the rest stop itself had come alive with something malevolent. It had been a mistake to stop here. He should have driven through the night, kept going, never stopped. Now it was too late. Joe managed to climb back into his truck, slamming the door behind him, and locked it. He tried to start the engine again, his foot pressing on the gas, his fingers trembling as they turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, but it didn't sound right, like it was straining, fighting against something. He kept the truck running, but the sound of the engine grew quieter, weaker. The shadows in the parking lot stretched even longer now, moving in odd ways. He could hear the wind picking up, though there wasn't a breath of breeze just moments ago. The whispers started again. They were soft at first, like a wind blowing through cracked windows, but then they grew louder, more insistent. "Joe." The voice was thin and jagged, like nails scraping against wood. It wasn't coming from the radio or any speaker. It was inside the truck, inside his head. He could feel it gnawing at his thoughts. The figure, the one from the rest stop, was there again. It wasn't outside the truck anymore. It was inside his mind, in the back of his skull. He could see its face now, clearer than ever before. The pale, ghostly skin, the empty eyes that seemed to peer into his soul. "Let me in." The voice crooned. Joe slammed his hands on the steering wheel, trying to drown out the whispers, trying to force himself to focus. He had to get away. He had to leave this place, or whatever this thing was would never let him go. But the truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, then went silent. It was as if the rest stop itself had somehow locked him in, holding him there against his will. He looked through the windshield. The parking lot was still empty, but the shadow, it was closer now, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Joe's breath caught in his throat. He could see the figure now, standing just a few feet away, its eyes locked onto his, and the faintest of grins curled on its face. He was no longer alone. The truck's lights flickered as the figure reached the window. Its hand pressed flat against the glass, leaving behind a dark, smudged imprint. The voice whispered again, barely audible but unmistakable. "You can't leave." The words echoed in Joe's mind, louder than the rumble of the engine or the flicker of the lights. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. He was trapped, his body frozen in place, his mind screaming for him to do something, anything. But the fear had paralyzed him. For a long moment, nothing moved. Time seemed to stand still as the figure loomed just outside the truck. Its grin grew wider, stretching impossibly far, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The shadows around it seemed to reach out, almost alive, as if trying to pull Joe toward them. Then, the figure did something Joe wasn't prepared. It smiled. Not the same grin, it was different. This time, it was a smile of victory. The figure turned and began to walk away, gliding across the parking lot like it was floating above the ground. Joe's mind reeled. He couldn't understand. It had been standing right there so close, and now it was leaving. But then, just before it disappeared into the shadows, it turned around one last time. And it said, with a voice so cold, so final, "I'll be waiting." Joe snapped back to reality, his foot pressing down on the gas. The engine roared to life as the truck lurched forward. He didn't dare look back as he tore out of the rest stop, his hands gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The shadows and whispers faded behind him, but the dread in his chest didn't. He drove, and he drove. For hours he kept driving, never stopping. Every time he glanced in his rearview mirror, he half expected to see the figure, that tall, dark presence following him, waiting for the right moment to return. But he never saw it again. Eventually, Joe made it to the next city. His hands were still shaking as he parked his rig, but he was alive. As he stepped out of the truck, a deep sense of relief flooded over him. He was free. It was over. Or so he thought. Weeks later, When Joe was unloading at a delivery dock, a worker approached him with a strange look on his face. "Hey man, you okay?" the worker asked. "You've got some kind of writing on the side of your trailer." Joe's heart skipped a beat. He turned slowly, his stomach sinking. On the side of the trailer, written in the dust and dirt, were 3 words: "I'm still here." Joe's blood ran cold. The rest stopped, the figure, the whispers, and they never would be. Rick had been driving trucks for over 15 years. He knew the long highways and remote back roads like the back of his hand. He had hauled everything from furniture to food, crossing states and cities, making deliveries and seeing the same few truck stops along the way. It was a lonely life, but he was used to it. His truck was his home on the road, and he didn't mind the silence. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Rick got a call from his dispatcher. It was a long haul that needed to be completed by morning. The load was a bit odd, a cargo of something he didn't know, but it didn't matter. The pay was good, and he was already in a small town in the middle of nowhere. He just wanted to finish the job and get back to his favorite diner, where the coffee was always hot and the food was greasy but good. Rick checked the GPS on his dashboard. The route would take him through some remote stretches of road, areas that were rarely used. He had driven them before, but it was always a little eerie at night. The road twisted and turned, passing through thick forests and empty towns that seemed to have been abandoned for years. He felt a chill run down his spine but shook it off. It was just the isolation of the road playing tricks on him. As he drove, the sky grew darker, and the winds started to pick up. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, but Rick kept his eyes on the road. The headlights of his truck cut through the dark, illuminating only the asphalt ahead of him. He flicked the radio on, trying to drown out the silence. Static hissed through the speakers, and then a voice broke through. "Hey, Rick. You there?" Rick frowned. It was an unfamiliar voice. "Who is this?" he asked, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "It's Bob. You know, from the truck stop up ahead. Thought you might be coming through this way. Just wanted to give you a heads up." Rick's confusion deepened. "Bob? I don't know any Bob." Yeah, I know. You're probably just tired. Happens to the best of us. Anyway, you should pull over when you get close. There's a storm coming. You'll want to wait." Rick thought about it for a moment. The storm was probably just a passing shower. He had driven through worse. "I'm good, Bob. I'll keep All right, but be careful. You never know what's out there in the dark," Bob's voice said, his tone suddenly cold. Rick shook his head and turned off the radio. He didn't like it when people tried to scare him on the road. There were always strange calls, and he'd learned to ignore them. But that one felt different. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the miles passed. The temperature dropped quickly, and the wind howled outside. He checked his mirrors but saw nothing. No other vehicles. It was just him and the empty road. But then, something strange happened. A flicker of light appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, Rick thought it was another truck, but it didn't look right. The lights were flickering, almost like they were struggling to stay on. Rick felt his heart rate pick up. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing. He continued driving, trying to stay calm. The light was still there, just barely visible in the mirror. It came closer, then disappeared. He thought it was a trick of the road or his mind playing games with him. But then, the truck's radio crackled again. "Rick, you still there?" The voice was distorted, like it was coming from far away. He sighed. "Yeah, I'm here." "You're not alone out there, you know," the voice said in a low whisper. "You should turn back. Go back to the truck stop." Rick's pulse quickened. The voice sounded like Bob, but there was something off about it. I'm fine. I'm almost there," Rick said, his voice. Listen to me, Rick. There's something out there. Something you don't want to meet. If you don't turn back now, it'll be too late." Rick laughed nervously. "I've been driving these roads for years. Nothing's out here but trees and empty towns." But as soon as he said it, the air around him seemed to grow heavier. The truck's engine stuttered and the lights flickered. Rick cursed under his breath and slammed his hand on the dashboard. Come on, you old thing," he muttered, tapping the steering. Then, without warning, the truck came to a stop. The headlights went dark, and the engine sputtered to a halt. Rick tried the ignition again, but nothing happened. He sat in the dark, staring at the empty road ahead. It was dead quiet now, no hum of the engine, no wind outside, just silence. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel. The air was cold, and the sky above was a deep shade of black. There was no sign of any storm, no clouds, just an unnatural stillness. Suddenly, Rick heard a sound behind him. It was soft at first, like the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. He spun around, but there was no one there. His heart began to race. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. No response, just more silence. He stepped back into the cab of the truck, trying the ignition again. Still nothing. The radio crackled to life once more. "Rick, I told you." The voice came through the static. It was Bob again, but now it was slower, almost distorted. "You should have listened. It's coming for you." Rick's blood ran cold. He glanced in the side mirror, and there, at the edge of the light, he saw it. A shadow, tall, dark, and formless, moving slowly toward him. What are you?" Rick shouted, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it grew larger, its shape slowly shifting as if it was trying to take form. Rick's breath hitched as the figure became clearer, revealing a face. A pale, hollow face with empty, black eyes and a twisted grin that stretched impossibly wide. The face was grinning at him, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Rick's heart pounded in his chest. He fumbled for the door handle, but his hand couldn't seem to work the latch. The creature stepped closer, its long, bony fingers reaching toward the truck. With a jolt, the engine roared to life, and the lights flickered back on. Rick slammed his foot on the gas pedal, not daring to look back as he sped down the road, the creature fading into the night behind him. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The truck rumbled down the deserted highway faster and faster, but no matter how hard he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still chasing him. It wasn't until dawn that Rick found the nearest truck stop. He pulled in, his hands still trembling. His truck was a mess, dirt and dust caked the windows, and there was a strange, cold feeling lingering inside. He didn't want to look back, but he couldn't help it. He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the pale face staring back at him. But there was nothing there. Rick let out a long, shaky breath and parked his truck. He didn't care about the load anymore. He was done. He never wanted to drive that stretch of road again. As he stepped out of the truck, he looked around the quiet truck stop. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over everything, but the memory of what happened would stay with him forever. He had learned something that night. The road wasn't as empty as it seemed. There were things in the dark that no one talked about, things that waited until you were alone, until you thought you were safe. Rick never spoke of what happened, but every time he passed that stretch of highway, he couldn't help but feel the chill of the air, the weight of the silence. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, he always knew that the thing in the dark was still out there, waiting for its next victim.